Not that Dean didn't love his other children, but Dean Paul was different. He was the one who understood him, the one who saw through the persona, the one who didn't want the spotlight, didn't want to live off his father's name, didn't want to be Dean Martin's son. He wanted to be his own man, a pilot, a professional, someone who earned respect without shortcuts. Dean admired that more than anything. He respected it. And when Dean Paul died, it felt to Dean like the one person who truly understood him had been ripped out of the world. From that day forward, Dean Martin disappeared. He stopped performing almost entirely. He canceled appearances. He turned down offers worth millions. He stopped going to Vegas, stopped hosting, stopped answering the phone. Friends would call and get nothing. Messages went unanswered. Invitations were ignored. Even Frank couldn't reach him. And if Frank Sinatra couldn't reach you, it meant you didn't want to be reached. Frank tried anyway. At first, he called every day, left messages, Dino, it's me, call me. Then every week, then every month. Sometimes he drove by Dean's house just to see if the lights were on. Sometimes he sent flowers on Dean Paul's birthday. Sometimes he'd sit alone and replay old memories in his head, wondering what he could have said differently, what he could have done. Frank had always been the fixer, the protector, the guy who could muscle the world into behaving if he had to. But grief doesn't respect power. You can't intimidate it. You can't buy it off. You can't sing it away. And Dean didn't want saving. He lived quietly, watched television, sat outside, smoked, drank less than people thought, but enough to dull the edge. People said he became bitter. He didn't. He became hollow. There's a difference. Bitter people lash out. Hollow people withdraw. Dean wasn't angry at the world. He just no longer felt part of it. Frank aged during those years, not just physically, but emotionally. Losing Dean without losing him was a special kind of pain. Their friendship had survived jealousy, fights, public humiliation, egos, scandals. It survived everything except silence. And after 8 years of that silence, Frank had finally started to believe that this was how it ended. Not with a blow-up, not with a final fight, just fading dot. Then the phone rang. Dina's voice on the other end wasn't composed. It wasn't polite. It wasn't Hollywood. It was raw. Frank, please. Dad wants to see you. He asked for you. I don't think he has much time. Frank didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even hang up properly. He just grabbed his coat and left. When he walked into Dean's house, the smell hit him first. Medicine, stale air, quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in rooms where people are dying. And then he saw Dean. The man who once filled rooms without trying now looked smaller than the furniture around him. His hands were thin, his face sunken. But when Dean looked up and saw Frank, something flickered back on. Not fully, just enough. "Hey, Francis," Dean said. Frank broke. He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Dean's hand like he was afraid it would disappear if he let go. "You stubborn son of a bitch," Frank said, laughing and crying at the same time. "You scared the hell out of me." Dean smiled. Dean smiled. "You always did scare easy." For 20 minutes, time bent. They talked about nothing and everything. Old jokes, old stories, things they hadn't thought about in decades. A bad show in Miami. A woman whose name neither of them could remember. A night in Vegas when they stayed up until sunrise for no reason at all. They laughed like 2 kids who had skipped school together. For those 20 minutes, Dean wasn't dying. Frank wasn't grieving. They were just Frank and Dean again. Then Dean's energy started to fade. He squeezed Frank's hand a little tighter, looked at him differently now. Serious, present Francis, he said softly. Yeah, Dino. Dean swallowed. His voice dropped. I'm sorry. Frank froze. I should have answered your calls, Dean continued. I should have let you in. I didn't mean to shut you out. I just didn't know how to be alive without him. Frank shook his head. You don't owe me, Dean interrupted him. I do. There was a pause. Dean's breathing was heavier now. Then he said the 4 words. I missed you, pal. Frank Losky. It not a tear rolling down his cheek. Not a dignified wipe of the eye. He collapsed into a chair and sobbed like a child who had just been found after being lost too long. 8 years of silence cracked open all at once. 8 years of guilt. 8 years of wondering if he'd failed his best friend when it mattered most. Dean watched him with tired eyes full of love. You never left me, Dean said. I left you. Frank wiped his face, shaking. You idiot, he whispered. I would have sat in that darkness with you. I didn't need you to be okay. Dean nodded slowly. I know that now. They sat there, hands still clasped, until Dean finally leaned back, exhausted. When Frank stood to leave, Dean pulled him close one last time. Thank you for coming, Dean said. I didn't want to go without seeing you. Frank kissed his forehead. I'll see you again, Dino. Dean smiled faintly. Yeah, you will. Dean Martin died days later, on Christmas Day, 1995 Frank Sinatra. Never talked much about that visit. When people asked, he'd changed the subject. But once, late in life, someone pressed him, asked what Dean's last words to him had been. Frank looked down for a long time. Then he said, he told me he missed me, and that's the greatest thing anyone ever said to me. Frank Sinatra died 3 years later, but people who knew them both said something strange and beautiful. They said that after that visit, Frank walked lighter, like a weight he'd been carrying for 8 years had finally been set down, like the silence had finally been answered. Because some friendships don't end in anger. They end in grief. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they end in forgiveness. Dean smiled, a real smile, not the public one, not the polished Dean Martin grin, but the small, tired smile of a man who was glad someone he loved had come back into his life. Yeah, Dean said softly. I finally caught up to myself. Frank tried to joke, because that's what he'd always done when things hurt too much. You always did take your time, Dino. Dean let out a faint chuckle that turned into a cough. Frank instinctively leaned forward, ready to help, but Dean waved him off. I'm all right. Just sit with me. So Frank did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but familiar. The kind of silence that only exists between people who've already said everything that matters at some point in their lives. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill. The afternoon light shifted across the room. Frank finally spoke. I've been thinking about you a lot. Din nadad. I know. I felt it. Frank swallowed. I tried, I didn't stop caring. I just didn't know how to get through to you. Dean looked at him then, really looked at him. I know you did. That's why it hurt so much. I couldn't let you see me like that. I didn't want you to remember me broken. Frank shook his head. You think I cared about that? I've seen you drunk, angry, jealous, terrified, and brilliant. Broken wouldn't he have scared me? Dean's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. It scared me, he said. When Dean Paul died, something shut off inside me. Not the sadness, the warning. I didn't want to sing. Didn't want to joke. Didn't want to be Dean Martin anymore. I was just a father who failed to protect his son. Frank leaned forward. You didn't fail him. Dean closed his eyes. Every father feels that way when they lose a child, doesn't matter what's true. That guilt lives there anyway. Frank nodded slowly. He knew that feeling. I kept telling myself, he'll come back. You always did. You always bounced back. Dean opened his eyes. This time, I didn't want to. The words hit Frank harder than anything else Dean had said. He sat back, stunned. Why? Because if I stayed here, Dean said quietly, it meant Dean Paul was really gone. And I wasn't ready to accept that. They sat with that truth between them. After a while, Dean shifted in his chair, clearly tiring. Frank noticed and stood. I don't want to wear you out. Dean reached for Frank's hand. His grip was weak, but deliberate. Don't go yet. Frank sat back down immediately. I asked you here for a reason, Dean said. I didn't want to leave without fixing this. Frank's throat tightened. There's nothing to fix. There is, Dean insisted. I disappeared. I shut you out. I let 8 years go by pretending I didn't need you. And that wasn't fair. You were my brother. Frank looked away, blinking fast. You were mine too. Dean nodded. I know. And I'm sorry. The room felt impossibly still. Dean took a slow breath, gathering strength. You know what the worst part was? Frank? What? Every time something funny happened. Every time I thought of an old story. Every time I wanted to laugh. You were the first person I wanted to tell. And I didn't. Frank let out a broken laugh. You stubborn bastard. Dean smiled faintly. Yeah. They laughed together, quietly, the sound fragile but real. Then Dean's expression softened, grew serious again. I don't have much time. I know that. I'm not afraid of dying anymore. I'm just afraid of leaving things unsaid. Frank leaned closer. Then say them. Dean looked at him, eyes steady. You were the best friend I ever had. You believed in me when I was just a nightclub singer. You stood up for me when I didn't ask you to. You brought me into your world and treated me like an equal when you didn't have to. And when everything fell apart for me, you never stopped knocking on the door. Frank's face crumpled. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Dean squeezed his hand gently. Those years, I was gone. I didn't stop missing you. I just didn't know how to come back. And then he said it again, slower this time, like he wanted Frank to really hear it. I missed you, pal? Frank broke completely. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Dean's hand, shoulders shaking. All the bravado, all the toughness, all the control that had defined Frank Sinatra for decades dissolved in that moment. He cried for the years lost, for Dean Poe, for the silence. For the friend he thought he'd day already lost. Gee, I missed you too, Frank whispered. Every damn day. They stayed like that for a long time. No music, no jokes, no audience. Just two old friends holding on to each other at the end. Eventually, Dean's breathing grew heavier. Dina appeared quietly in the doorway, concern written on her face. Frank noticed and nodded to her. I'll go, he said softly. Dean shook his head slightly. Not yet. Frank smiled through tears. You still ordering me around? Always did, Dean murmured, when Dean finally closed his eyes. Exhausted, Frank stood and leaned down, kissing his forehead gently. I'll see you again. Dino. Dean opened his eyes just long enough to smile. Save me a seat. Frank left the house quietly. He sat in his car for a long time afterward, hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. For the first time in years, his chest didn't feel tight. The silence wasn't painful anymore. It was settled. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. At Dean's funeral, Frank stood apart from the crowd. When someone asked him what Dean had meant to him, Frank said only this. He was my calm when I didn't know how to slow down. And I was his noise when he didn't know how to feel alive. We needed each other. Years later, when Frank himself was nearing the end, he told someone close to him, "The hardest thing I ever lived through wasn't losing Dean. It was thinking I'd lost him before I actually did. But he came back. He always did." Some friendships don't end. When people stop talking, they just wait. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they get one last moment to say what matters most. He actually smiled. A crooked little grin that Frank hadn't seen in years. You should see the other guy. And just like that, something unlocked. Not the old days, not the noise and the chaos and the endless nights, but something quieter and deeper. For this moment, in this room, they were Frank and Dean again. Not legends, not icons, just two men who had lived too much life together to pretend it didn't matter. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing, about everything, about things that didn't matter anymore and things that always had. Frank reminded Dean about the night in Vegas, when Dean bet him he couldn't eat an entire cheesecake by himself. Frank had done it, stubborn as hell, then thrown up in the casino fountain while security pretended not to see a thing. Dean laughed. Hey-ow, laughed. His shoulders shook, his chest rattled, and for a second, the sound filled the room like it used to. The laugh turned into coughing, deep and painful. But even then, Dean was smiling. "Worth it!" he wheezed. "Absolutely worth it." They talked about Sammy, about Joey, about nights at the sands that felt like they'd last forever. "You remember when we almost got arrested in Miami?" Frank said. Dean squinted. "Which time?" They talked about women, about ex-wives, about mistakes that felt funny now and ones that still stung. Dean asked about Frank's kids, about his grandkids. Frank told him stories. Dean Lasand really listened, like time suddenly mattered again. For those 20 minutes, Dean wasn't waiting to die. He was alive, present, the man Frank had loved, like a brother for most of his life. Then Dean's breathing changed. Slower, heavier. The effort showed on his face. Frank saw it immediately. He always had. He stood up, even though every instinct told him not to. "I should let you sleep, pal." Dean nodded slightly. "Yeah." Frank walked toward the door. His hand touched the knob. This was it. I knew it. Dean knew it. The room felt unbearably quiet, like it was holding its breath. Frank. Dean's voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. Clearer than it had been all day. Frank turned around. "You were always there." 4 words. They hit Frank harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Harder than loss. Harder than regret. Because they weren't just words. They were forgiveness, recognition, gratitude, love. Dean wasn't just talking about the good years. He was talking about the years Frank kept knocking when Dean wouldn't answer. The calls that went unreturned. The visits that ended in silence. The patience. The refusal to walk away. Frank crossed the room in 2 steps, dropped to his knees beside Dean's chair, and took his hand. Dean's grip was weak, barely there, but it tightened just enough to be felt. "Always, Dean," Frank said, his voice breaking completely. "Always, Dean, nada." His eyes were wet now, but calm. "I know," he whispered. "That's why I wanted to see you, to say thank you for not giving up. Even when I did." Frank cried openly. No shame, no restraint. "You're my brother," he said. "You always will be." Dean smiled faintly. Ring-ding-ding, pow. Frank laughed through tears. Ring-ding-ding. He stayed a little longer, holding Dean's hand, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. When he finally stood to leave, Dina walked him to the door. Frank's face was red, his eyes swollen. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "No," Frank replied. "Thank you for calling me. I needed. We both did. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, 78 years old. His lungs finally gave out. Frank got the call that morning. He'd been expecting it, but it still felt like the floor disappeared beneath him. Frank didn't go to the funeral. He couldn't. He'd already said goodbye. Those 20 minutes. Those 4 words. That was his farewell. Instead, Frank spent Christmas Day alone. Scotch in his glass. Dean's records on the turntable. Crying like a child. Frank lived 3 more years, and people noticed something different about him after Dean was gone. He softened. He called people more. Told them he loved them. Said things he used to keep buried, because Dean's words had reminded him of something simple and brutal and true. Being there matters. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, his daughter Tina found a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket, worn thin, carried everywhere. On it, written in Frank's handwriting, were 4 words. You were always there. Dean's words. The ones that broke him, the ones that healed him,